Good, thank you. Okay, so I think to date we've heard a lot of kind of theory and kind of concepts and ideas, and this panel discussion, this conversation, is going to be quite unique in that we get to speak to someone who is in a position of power, who's kind of in a sense made it. So here we'll get a chance to see kind of, what is it like when you actually start implementing these ideas, when kind of the rubber hits the road, so to speak. How does governing work? I suspect there's a lot of kind of compromise, negotiation here. So that's something we'll look to kind of learn and understand. So we're very appreciative that Rokhsana has taken the time out. Obviously, being the mayor of Newham is an extremely busy job. It's a 24/7 job. She's literally just come straight from Newham to here. So very appreciative of that. We're going to kick off, in a sense, I could kind of very briefly introduce you, but the purpose of the conversation is to kind of get to know Rokhsana. So obviously she's from the Labour Party, she's the mayor of Newham, she achieved an OBE in 2009 and was conferred an honorary fellowship by UCL in 2022 in recognition of her political services. But we want, in a sense, kind of get to know the Rokhsana Fiaz, the person, the human, the individual. So we're going to start by going back to your childhood to kind of understand, Rokhsana, kind of where have you come from? Kind of discussing kind of your formative years. So you were born in Mile End Hospital, you grew up in Newham. I want to get a sense of what was life like in the 1970s in a city, London. What was life like growing up in the Fiaz household? Did you come from a political family? Kind of what drove you? Just give us a little bit of colour about your formative years.
Thank you very much. And Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Really, really lovely to be here. And also, I must say, if it's okay with you, can I stand up on occasion? It's really, really lovely. Can everyone hear me, first of all? Yes. Yeah. It's really lovely to be here, particularly given that there are so many loved faces and inspiring people that have really informed my thinking as I've progressed in my life journey and also in my political journey as well. And I wanted to reflect on the questions that you've asked about who I am and what's been my inspiration and those formative years. Without doubt, it has to be the following: the lived experience of being part of a racialised, minoritised community during a time when one's faith identity marker wasn't as pronounced and focused upon in a way that it is now, and in very visceral ways as well. But it was the colour of my skin. More to the point, it was the colour of my mum and dad's skin that was an issue for the world that I grew up in. And I don't think any young person that grew up in the 1970s and experienced firsthand, either directly on an individual level, be it in the playground, where you would admire, but now recognise that's internalised racism, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls that looked so pristine and were favoured, and that's your experience at an age where you didn't really understand the concept of privilege and white privilege and structural racism and how it works. But for me, it was the experience of my mum and dad navigating Newham, the borough, at a time when there was a real prominence given to white privilege and the National Front and that era of the far right. And I have very vivid recollections of walking with my mother down Green Street, which is quite a famed street. We have one of the longest historical council-owned markets called Queen's Market. We had at the time West Ham Football Club, and I would very much be struck by the cacophony of noise of the football fans or hooligans, depending on which side of the fence you stood. And people of colour just going about their day-to-day lives, in spite of listening to the hiss in sound and remarks about curry smells or they don't belong here. I remember an occasion where my mother and father, we had gone to see their friends, and myself and I think it would have been my younger sister were ushered to the car, and someone, a white gentleman, had said a remark to my mother. My father heard, and they got into a bit of a fisticuff. And then my mum and dad jumped into the car, and I remember hearing my mum say, you know, what an idiot. So I think that's informative, because it tells you at that age, don't take that type of abuse and hostility, stand up for yourself. And I also remember many occasions at the breakfast table or dinner table, but predominantly breakfast, my father and mother would curiously have delivered to the house the Daily Junk, which would be about 2 days out from the publication date, because it had to come all the way from Pakistan, but also Country Life. And I'll come to Country Life in a moment. I know, real juxtaposition. And I remember Mum and Dad talking a lot about what was happening in Pakistan at the time. And I remember very vividly the black and white grainy photograph of Bhutto being actually hung. And my mum and dad talking about the military junta having taken over and democracy in Pakistan ending. I also heard a lot of commentary about India. I heard a lot of commentary about English people and how we are not like them, and it's important to stick with your own, which was quite difficult given that my mum and dad were of that pioneering generation from the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan in particular, albeit my father was 4 when partition happened and his family grew up in the India side of Pakistan, and my mother and her family had been in the Lahore part of the Punjab. And I remember feeling very challenged about issues of identity when, on the one hand, because of the first generation immigrant experience, you're hearing your parents say, just, you know, be mindful about who you mix with, and don't forget your roots. But we had no family. We were probably the first of the Asian diaspora that settled in Newham, albeit my father, when he came to the UK in 1960, and my mother joined him a few years after that, he settled in Tower Hamlets for a few years. And we had, through him, a family business which is very much indicative or reflective of the immigrant story. You want to get on. My father had multiple jobs, including being a bus driver, and would regale stories about living off Commercial Road with a bunch of friends, and they would do the swap for daytime work and then evening. And that's quite interesting. So there's a lot of noise that made up the soundtrack to my early years formation. But one thing that I would say, and I'm not just saying it because it's a gathering of Muslim friends, brothers and sisters, indeed allies, I've always had an indelible sense of being true to God, to Allah, and being very reflective, and would have dialogue with God. And I would imagine, as I try to get to sleep, I would be on a cloud and I would go up to Allah and just have a conversation with him about how my day went and whether or not I was performing to the requirements that he wants from all of us in our service to people and our communities. And I suspect that that is something that has led to what I am currently doing and the things that I've done up until this point. And then finally, in terms of political inspiration, given the context of family, talking about politics, but it was politics of Pakistan and the Indian subcontinent, I was really inspired and informed at the age, or between the ages of 10 and 11, because of the racism that I experienced, even though I couldn't characterise it as such, because at the age of 8 or 9, you're led to feel different because of what wider society says and what you hear. But I was also inspired by Roots, and then the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi, and also Malcolm X.
Cool, thank you, Rokhsana. So if we just stick to your childhood just for now. So I understand at the age of 20, the family home got repossessed. So what impact did that have on you? Did your family become homeless effectively? Just tell us a little bit about that, and kind of whether that was a bit of a trigger as well in terms of some of your values and your drive.
So for those that may not know, Asim, I think I may have explained it to you in part. So my father set up a business, a factory in Aldgate off Lehman Street, which is now a hotel. And I went to a conference a few years ago and then realised actually the conference was taking place in the right spot that my father's factory was at. And he then, the business grew well at one stage, and this is obviously all pre-globalisation, when the whole manufacturing industry completely got disrupted and collapsed in this country. Supplying to Marks and Spencer's, C&A and the like. So parents, saved up, and we bought a really nice house on the edge of Newham. And then one day, it was a Christmas, I had come back from a 2-week stint in Pakistan with my mum. She wanted to go and see her family for the Christmas period. And I heard the postman and the letters drop, and I went to pick them up, and I saw one that said, urgent for the house owner only. And I came into the kitchen, my mum was making breakfast, opened it, and it just said, we're going to repossess your house in 7 days' time. So basically what had happened, and what I could discern, was that my father went into a business venture, remortgaged the house without letting my mum know, and this is a house that my mum and dad had pretty much put all of their savings in and took out a really small mortgage, and the business partner had embezzled all the money, leaving my dad with debts leading to, I think it would have been at the time, about £750,000. And this was 1992. And so we had 1 week to pretty much pack everything in this new house. And then we sofa surfed for about 4 to 5 weeks whilst we were working through, whilst my mum and dad engaged with the council. And as you can imagine, that was really unpleasant. I was at university. I decided to make the decision, being the eldest of 2 daughters in a sibling pecking order where there's 4 of us and I'm number 3, that it would make sense for everyone else not to be disrupted and disturbed. And part of that was because I actually didn't enjoy university. I didn't enjoy university life. I found it really isolating. I really missed London. I was not able to get used to...
Which university?
I went to Wolverhampton, and then I came back to London, and I must admit I hated Wolverhampton. I hated... sorry, there's... No, not because it was Wolverhampton. I just didn't enjoy student life. I got involved in politics. That's the point at which I got involved in the national network called Labour Students. It was called National Organisation of Labour Students. And it was the university arena of the Labour Party organising through the student movement, and then you'd also have the Young Socialists.
And why did you get involved in politics, the Labour Party?
Because I want to change the world. So, actually, because I got the politics as a route to changing the world when I did my A-levels, and I did government and politics in Newham, and I had three tutors, one who was a socialist, one who was a conservative, and one who was a Liberal Democrat. I learned the history of the Labour movement from 1881 to Second World War, and so I fell in love, I guess, with the romantic history of the Labour movement in this country and elsewhere, because it spoke to me about the importance of organising and actually how outside of singularity, if you are able to group and build allyship, there is the opportunity to really disrupt and change things for the better. And also, my informative years, and as a consequence of my faith, you want to be helping and supporting those that are the most exposed, vulnerable, impoverished, of which I see a lot in my job presently. And to the point of temporary accommodation, because I think your question also asked, how does it inform your thinking in what you do now? So I was saying before we started that I'm currently going through a process of setting the council's budget for the next 2026-27 financial year, and we've got to set a legal budget, and we're currently facing a budget forecast gap of £52 million next year, £63 million the year after, and £90 million the year after that, and that's all largely because of temporary accommodation costs. As a local authority, we are legally obliged to place people in temporary accommodation so that we don't have people living on the streets and are destitute, but that's pretty much eaten up, yeah. So,
and presumably the left-wing tradition against kind of racism, injustice, that's kind of, because others have chosen to go down the Conservative Party route, for example, that wasn't for you.
Yeah. I don't disrespect anyone for the agency they use in terms of how they pursue politics or any aspect of their lives. Of course, I've got red lines and boundaries. They're not going to be my besties. But I've got some really good friends who are Conservative Party members. Not so many friends that are Liberal Democrats. Not particularly many friends that are members of the Green Party. Either. I'm not making a political point.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Yeah. We'll come to that later.
It was not deliberate, I promise you.
We'll come to that later.
No, you can't take it back.
So Rokhsana, let's move now beyond your childhood. So now let's talk about your career before you entered politics. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Oh gosh, right. So when we do come to the political part, because there will be a question, how did you become the mayor? And I will regale you with the Star Wars analogy, because it was pretty much Star Wars. And I have done pretty much a full spectrum spanning community organising, including campaigning against racism, which was a particular prominent area of interest when I was also involved in student politics, and very much in student politics, as well as the broad agenda stuff around tackling issues of systemic racism as it related to racist attacks primarily. There wasn't really anyone at the time that was dealing with structural racism and how that impacts the life chances of people of colour in this country. And I feel really, really impassioned about those issues, and I still amplify structural racism in the work that I do as the mayor, both in Newham and through using my platform when I'm interacting at the London-wide stage and nationally. But I've done community development, I've worked at McDonald's. My first job was flipping burgers at East Ham, High Street North McDonald's. I have run a kids' summer scheme. I have worked in broadcast journalism. I worked for Granada Media for about 5 years. I was working on the Jonathan Dimbleby programme in the factual department of Granada Media over in the South Bank. In between each series ending, we would be assigned different factual programmes during the summer months, and so I did things like Airline. I did a special with Trevor, what's his name, who's really controversial now? Trevor Phillips, yeah. I cannot understand his trajectory and his journey, and I think that's something really interesting for us to be considering when we're thinking about actually issues of British Muslim identity. And a thought that I get quite exposed a lot to in my role as a mayor who happens to be Muslim and a woman and of this colour, there's an assumption that there's a homogeneity in our politics and our political thinking, and that's so far removed from the reality and the case. I would like to think that my politics very much are imbued and fashioned by fundamental values and beliefs that are informed by my religious identity, but I don't wear it on my sleeve. What else have I done? I've worked in public affairs. I've worked for interfaith organisations. I worked my last interfaith arena of work was for a billionaire philanthropist, working to cement better ties between Muslims, Jews and people of the Christian faiths, because we all subscribe to the Abrahamic faith tradition, and the work there was largely international in its focus. It was UNESCO supported, developed as part of a contribution to SHE curricula for primary school kids, how you use art to be able to get young people to be thinking about traditions and civilizational history, and then unpacking through that the commonalities that we all share as human beings, regardless of what religion you subscribe to. One of my policy specialisms at the time before I stepped into local government was the prevent side of counter-terrorism work and contest, and I had set up an organisation called the Change Institute, and working with some colleagues here, undertook some really important work looking at the antecedents of how an ideology gained traction in different Muslim community fields across Europe, and actually Yahya was fundamental and critical to the work by the research team that examined the UK landscape. And actually to this day, that piece of work, Yahya, I don't know if you know, is still referred to not just amongst academia, but also amongst practitioners. Did a lot of work for the European Union on convening a European network of experts in radicalisation. But we were really keen to challenge the orthodoxy of and hegemonic thinking about Muslim communities, and actually took real issue with attempts to securitise Muslim communities at that time and since. I remember actually during my time at Granada Media, I don't know whether any of you remember, as I was saying, there's a period of my time where I worked there on the Jonathan Dimbleby programme in particular. So it was coming to the end of the summer season, and I had been assigned airline, and as it so happens, I was at Luton Airport for the whole summer, doing various stuff with the film crew. And I had woken up on the day of 9/11, and I'd got to Luton Airport. I think it would have been around 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning, because we were going to start filming, and we began to film for the airline series. And then 9/11 happened, and I remember being in the airport. I didn't actually get home until 6 o'clock the next morning, because we were tasked with continuing to film and feeding our live feeds from the airport to all the news channels. But I remember watching, internally aghast, the Twin Towers, and you knew the world was going to just change incredibly and indelibly from that point on. And this came not long after the Iraq War One, Iraq War Two, and I was in university during the Second Iraq War, and I didn't get really involved in any of that, which was curious because I was involved in student politics, but I think I just didn't want to get, I don't know, I think I was still trying to fashion in my mind what this all meant for me and for my family and my friends back in London. But yeah.
Okay. So as you moved from your pre-political career into politics, just tell us what you learned in the kind of the policy space, community space, that was most useful, and what surprised you when you entered the party political field?
So I would say policy thinking, policy development is amongst the most amazing, enriching, rewarding intellectual pursuits. And you certainly see firsthand, if you undertake across the different methodologies that you can, social action research, the condition facing so many communities and people in this country, and you know that ultimately, unless you have influence and unless you know how to navigate the political system in all of its, in every single aspect of its shape, and it's not just the aspects and dimensions of politics that we know. It goes much more deeper, and it's as much about relationships, political relationships, including relationships between and amongst friends, and it's as much about cycles, what's coming up, what's coming down, what's factionally fashionable, what's factionally not, the zeitgeist, both in this country and internationally. I realised that that intellectual inquiry in pursuit of the truth, and in some desired hope that it will help influence, it does, but it doesn't at the same time, unless you can construct galvanising forces to elevate it and make it be taken seriously and be embraced by whichever powerful, influential current is in vogue at that time.
So tell us about how you navigated through, in your case, Labour Party. Just tell us about what the challenges were, what the obstacles were. Just give us a sense of navigating yourself to the top, at least in Newham.
So I'm going to just narrow it in on the process in the run-up to becoming the mayor of Newham. I made a bit of a quip, but I'll tell you the Star Wars story. So I'm going to use a cultural analogy. And it probably will turn up as a I keep on jokingly referring it to as my Netflix drama series that will probably have 8 series. Look, I never figured that local government was that interesting, but if there's one thing that you take out from this session and conversation today, it is probably the most powerful arena that you can access to change lives. Do not underestimate how much power is in localities, and it will accelerate more and more in the context of what this new government has announced in terms of its devolution and local government reorganisation agenda. We have probably the most centralised national government of any country in the world, and it has impeded people being able to get on with their lives. It has, in my mind, from what I've seen firsthand, led to an ossification of thinking in local government and the entrenchment of cultures, both system-wide and micro-cultures within departments, where people, all of whom are good, all think they're, very much advancing for the public good, in the spirit of public service. I've seen so much money being wasted. I've seen so much orthodox thinking that is really not helping our communities.
Could you give some examples of that?
So, for instance, I mentioned going through budget setting process, which I do every single year, and every single year I will point to officers and say, actually, if we undertake some disruptive thinking, look at integrating some services, we'll be able to unlock both the outcomes to the beneficiaries that we want to achieve, and we'll also be able to use money better and be shifting our focus on early intervention and prevention over just dealing with the immediacy. It takes so much time because you're having to deal with resistant cultures. So I have, for example, one area of all local authorities which is under massive pressure is children's services. In Newham, we have a cohort of about, I'd say, 3,500 young people that come from disrupted, challenged family household environments, coupled with a landscape of amongst the most entrenched, pronounced poverty. So you will have heard that the government's kind of gotten rid of the 2-child benefit cap. Newham, that's going to benefit 15,600 children, the highest number in London. We've got an allocation of up to £2.2 million to provide holiday activities and food to eligible kids, i.e. kids that are poor, be they at primary school age or at secondary school. That's 25,000 kids in that part of East London. But in the absence of dealing with things from an early intervention preventative approach, we are still having to deal with kids that are so exposed to vulnerability. And there's one young person, I use this as an illustration when I'm having conversations with residents about budgets and why we're having to do these trade-offs and difficult choices within the constraints of local government, because I don't have a magic wand and I'm not dealing with macroeconomic policy. There is one young person that we are having to place out of borough in order to protect their lives because they're involved in gangs. It costs us £1 million a year. That's just one person. One child who's under the age of 18. Now, if you do not deal with the systemic issues that leaves that young person vulnerable to exploitation, being drawn into county lines, it's largely economic condition. If you don't address the economic condition of that household, the family, which no doubt will be either both parents work in multiple jobs, those influencing figures of adults in a young person's life not being around as much, or for whatever reasons those parents or parent has vulnerabilities. If you don't deal with all of those things, then we're just going to carry on doing a plaster job, and it's such a huge waste of money. And one final example, so the last 2 weeks, and this just gives you an insight in terms of the kind of things that are thrown at you, be you a counsellor, but certainly in terms of my practice as a leader in my role as the Executive Mayor of Newham. 2 weeks ago, I just got this random email from this young person. He's 13 and was just pretty much, right, you've got to listen to me. I'm done with playing with the system, dealing with the system. I don't know how he got my email address. But I need you to help me. I want to get out of my family home. I want to be placed in a residential schooling environment. Describing his family situation. And over the past 2 weeks, including emailing him today, I've had to explain to him that we can't just give you a placement in a residential education environment. We're going to have to go through a process. And yes, I don't have those powers. I don't have those superpowers, even though I've got this title as the mayor. That's a statutory function that needs to be undertaken through an assessment by qualified social workers. And I know it's really hard for you to hear this. A very, very articulate young teenager. And I said, and this is all via email, you know, I've even offered to meet with him. And he's, right, why do you want for us to meet? What is it that you're going to be able to give me? Because if you can't give me what I want, there's no point in us meeting. And having that engagement with a young person, but it is really important that the voice of a young child is heard, because that's what we've asserted as an important principle under my administration. I want Newham to be the best place in the world for a child and young person to grow up. And I'm wanting to also be honest with all of our residents, including residents that are young. These are the hard realities, and I don't have superpowers, and you're going to have to go through this process. It may end up with what you want, but it may not, because I have a role as well to help support young persons understanding, but also set boundaries. Does that help?
Yeah, it does, yeah. So, Rokhsana, in your modesty, you have jumped over your election win.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Just give us a sense of that. How did you win?
Okay.
Just a little bit of your campaign.
Right, so basically, I'm going to jump back into Star Wars cultural reference. So I didn't want to go into local government, was always thinking about going into Parliament. Don't understand why, hence my comment earlier, local government is really where it's at. I was persuaded by some colleagues who were councillors, because we had a leader at the time who had been the mayor of Newham or leader of the council for something like 30 years. And there's this curious process in the political party that I am a member of, called a selection process. And arguably, there were ways found to make sure that he kept on being selected. And I said to colleagues at the time, look, I'm happy to help to get to what's called an open selection, so that the membership of the party locally can choose from a range of candidates. I'll give you 4 years of my life and then I'm out of here. I was not expecting to be the mayor of Newham. I wasn't even intended to put myself forward. And we pretty much, in Star Wars fashion, took on Darth Vader and the dark side, and we won. And it also included having an eyeball-to-eyeball situation with the Labour Party, because we were going to take them to court, and then they blinked. And we managed to get a selection process that was open to shortlisted candidates. And by that point, that would have been the autumn of 2017. I was in a room with the mission team, as it were, which I have to say has dissipated. And that's one sort of lesson for anyone who's keen about politics, but also keen about building movements. How do you constantly cannibalise the mission movement and team and get fresh people in? Because I think it's just part of human nature that people will peel off, or people will have other desires or objectives, or they're unhappy about what you've done. And as I said to someone recently, there's always a vacancy in politics, and don't lose sight of that. But it was basically this Jedi against Darth Vader on the dark side, and we won. And then I was in this room several months before, as this was all happening, and the mission team was saying we need a viable candidate. And everyone turned round, and I turned round in this room, and there was a blank wall. And I said, no, 4 years of my life, I told you, right, it's got to be someone else. And then after a few weeks of badgering, I relented. And,
Okay.
then that's what happened.
That's how your name was selected. But tell us about the campaigning, because you still have to get elected, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, I put myself forward as a candidate. I had to go through a process of being selected through a Labour Party, a process overseen by the Labour Party. It was a two-horse race between myself and my predecessor. There was lots of dastardly stuff that was done during that selection campaign, including, there was one instance where a local member that I had campaigned to and asked for their selection vote for me called me in real distress, saying that they had spoken to someone from the team that were advocating for my predecessor, and had got duped and had handed over their election numbers, and their vote got cast by someone else, for someone else, and not for me. I also was exposed to some pretty crap stuff. I had what was called the famed Levinson moment. One individual who was a councillor then and still, I don't know what happened, but she was recorded as saying, if Rokhsana gets selected and then elected as the Mayor of Newham, she's going to get rid of free school meals, which was a primary school, universal primary school meal provision that we put in place, which costs the council £6 million, albeit the last couple of years, because it's been covered by the Mayor of London, we're not having to pay that. But basically said, because she doesn't have children, she doesn't understand how life is for people with children, and that became front page news in the local rag. That was not very nice.
So how thick-skinned do you have to be to do your job?
You have to be very thick-skinned, and it's something. Your resilience, your adaptability is something that you learn whilst you're on the job. I mean, I thought I was pretty tough, but it's been really hideous at times, and it's unrelenting. And the last couple of years have been some pretty hard things that I've had to do in order, one, to stay true to my values. There's no point being a leader if you can't live to the values that you abide by. And also, curiously, you often hear the importance of being able to speak truth to power. And even if you're in a position of power, you need to have the strength and the courage to speak truth to power, even if you're part of that power structure, which no doubt we will come to. But I'm going to have to be careful because I've signed a legal agreement with the council.
So Rokhsana, give us some examples of when you felt your values were being challenged and how you went about that, just some colour to that.
I would say, on the whole, I don't believe I have had a situation during my time as the Mayor of Newham when I've been considering a policy-led decision where I think it's compromised my values. I think the time where I felt really challenged was linking to the Speak Truth to Power point. I, as a woman of colour, as a Muslim, have been exposed to amongst the most insidious, awful, not just racism or Islamophobia, but misogyny. And I've had to call it out in my own organisation. And I've had to challenge my organisation for not protecting and safeguarding me, which they have a legal duty to. And the behaviours were coming from other elected representatives, and we have a code of conduct, and we have all of these words on paper that say this is going to be a place of safety, and that's very much amplified as it rightly relates to people that work for the council, but it is also something that extends to elected representatives. And I found in my pursuit of requesting that the council treat an elected representative's behaviour as a code of conduct issue, I then discovered that the process that should have been followed in line with our constitution and the law wasn't. And there were times where, as that process was commencing, I really wanted to give up, as in I just wanted it to stop. And probably those were the moments where I felt challenged in not pursuing my values, and then I managed to find the strength, primarily through the help of a really amazing lawyer. Yeah.
So in terms of the discrimination you faced, just tell us, obviously you have misogyny, you have Islamophobia. Was it just an intersectionality of all of those things? Or?
Yeah, I think public bodies, I think, to be fair, pretty much most of society doesn't understand really the experience, the lived experience of intersectional discrimination. I mean, I would say, or I'd like to think, that most of us women in the room, even if we can't articulate and describe it, know what it feels like. And it's something that I also see manifest in different ways in different parts of public service delivery. So in addition to being the Mayor of Newham, I have a portfolio of responsibilities. So I appoint a cabinet and I assign cabinet members to do either adult social care or education or children's services, housing services and the like. And I do inclusive economy and strategic housing delivery. But I keep an eye on everything, and I'm really, really disturbed at the inefficacies of the health system and the impact that that's going to have on minoritised members of our community as they age. And I think there's a lot of work that we've got to do in that area. I'm really, really concerned about the structural aspects of access into the labour market, not just for young people, but for people of colour. I mean, we were really exposed during COVID-19 at one point. There was a few weeks where we had the highest mortality rate because of COVID-19. Deprivation that was really compounded by COVID-19 because COVID-19 tore communities that are entrenched and seeped in poverty. And we still haven't learnt the lessons. And in spite of me placing at the centrality of my administration from the point at which I stepped into office, and as articulated in my first term manifesto, one people at the heart of everything that we do, and that was a genuine response to a paternalistic top-down we know best, to an open up, but actually we are the servants of the people of the borough, and how do I ensure that that happens? And the only thing that I can do is use my executive powers as the mayor in a system that has developed over 30, 40, 50 years to think in a different mode. And that, you know, and that's taken a long time to shift. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to do.
So just tell us a bit more about your actual kind of executive powers that you have, and maybe just set out some of what you feel have been your biggest achievements to date.
So in local government, you have 3 governance models. You have the predominant model, which is a leader and cabinet model, and the leader is elected as a councillor. The councillor is elected as a councillor represented in political party. The political party that has the most councillors then makes up the ruling party of a council, and then the councillors decide who their leader is, and that can change every year, or it can be the same person for a 4-year term. Then you have committee system, and that's whereby a lot of the management of the council and policy shaping is done through committees of councillors as determined by the ruling party, but they have to do lots of trade-offs and negotiations with minority parties. And then you have what's called an executive mayoral model, which we've got in Newham, and it's one of 7 in London. And the most recently formed directly elected mayor was Croydon, and they ran their first executive mayor elections in 2022. But last year, actually earlier this year, the government announced that it was going to do away with executive mayoral systems at unitary authority level and only stick to regional mayors. So you've got the Mayor of London, you've got Greater Manchester Mayor, and they've designated the existing 13 executive mayoral models in local government as legacy mayoralities, but they're going to make them easier to get rid of if the council wants. But basically, I've got all executive powers reside in me as one individual, as defined by the Local Government Act and the Localism Act. So the Local Government Act 1989 and the Localism Act 2000. So I do pretty much 90 of all of all decisions that need to be made by elected representatives in Newham. I'm responsible for pretty much about 90 to 95% of the executive decisions, and then the remaining are done by full council. So that's like the local plan is a determination and a decision of the whole of council. The approval of a chief executive of a council is done by full council. Me approving officers spending anything over £1 million, I sign off. But what I did in 2019, I delegated my executive powers to my cabinet, but I can readily evoke them. So when COVID-19 happened and when we needed to take urgent decisions, I ended up having to take some executive, sort of directly elected mayor powers.
And how big are these budgets that you manage?
So Newham Council is a unitary authority in a borough that's the 9th largest local authority by population in the country. We've got, most recently, in terms of ONS outturn figures, we've got a population of 383,000 people. We're likely to grow to the 500,000 mark in the next 10 to 15 years. 38% of our resident population are under the age of 24. since 2018, just to that point actually, because we'll have more under 24-year-olds than we'll have over 24-year-olds in about 15 years' time. So what I've started since I became the mayor is begin to orientate the council's thinking with regards to that youth population profile that will be something that we're going to need to structurally and organisationally and operationally respond to. I had 3 full-time equivalent youth workers, 5 part-time youth workers, dilapidated youth zones when I stepped into office in a borough which was number 3 in London for county lines and knife crime. And now I've reinvested in youth empowerment services to the tune of about 5 million. And we've now got 47 full-time equivalent youth workers, including a detached youth worker team. And we're considered amongst the best youth services in the country and seen most recently as gold standard. But we're a council with a £1.5 billion budget, as in that's what we will spend, including assets that we own. But each year we have a revenue budget of about 378 million. Most of that goes to temporary accommodation, adult social care and education, just leaving a really small amount. But it's really hard because it's financially challenging. We don't get enough money.
So Rokhsana, thank you. Just to widen the conversation up a little bit before I open it up to the floor, do you think Muslim politicians or politicians of colour in mainstream parties have to overcompensate in any way?
I genuinely, may sound like a peculiar response, I genuinely suspect so, but I don't know. And what I mean by that, I have come across some of the most amazing, interesting politicians of colour and that are white Indigenous. And similarly, I've come across some not particularly brilliant politicians of all colours. I think that certainly in ecosystems that are culturally attuned to sort of the dominance of a ethnic community, white community, you have to prove hard. And I know that it's really difficult for a lot of councillors and politicians at local government level to be heard, and it makes me really upset and sad that something that I have consistently fought about, i.e. the issue of equity in political representation in mainstream politics, is something that we have got a little bit better numerically, but substantively in terms of actually how power and influence works. I think we're still very much have a long, long way to go. And part of that is around how you operate in spheres and circles of influence. And as much as you create your own circles of influence, you've also got to ensure that they're part of the establishment beltway arena of political influence as well.
Okay, and the last question from me, Rokhsana, is if you could speak to your 20-year-old self now, what would be some of the biggest lessons you'd want to say to her?
Don't be afraid to not be polite. I think we have been socialised too much to not offend. I mean, don't be offensive, of course, you know, not at all advocating people go around effing and blinding or pushing back, but hold your ground. I think that's what I mean, hold your ground. It's instilling, hold on to your confidence and your courage to speak your truth. Be adept at playing the game. because it is a game. Be tactical, be smart. You don't always have to talk. It's like a chess game as well. And be continually looking at the subtle changes as much as the big changes. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's open it. Let's give her a round of applause.